Imagine waking up one morning to discover that nuclear missiles capable of destroying your city in minutes had been secretly placed just a few hundred kilometers from your home. In October 1962, this wasn't fiction, it was reality. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the edge of nuclear war. Historians still consider it the closest humanity has ever come to global nuclear catastrophe. The Second World War ended in 1945, but peace did not bring lasting friendship between its two most powerful victors. The United States championed democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union promoted communism under a centralized government. Their rivalry spread across politics, technology, espionage, and military power in what became known as the Cold War. Although they never fought each other directly on a battlefield, both nations competed to expand their influence around the world. Both countries raced to build larger and more powerful nuclear arsenals. Scientists developed hydrogen bombs that were many times stronger than those used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Long-range bombers and ballistic missiles meant that an attack could reach the other side of the world within minutes. The fear of nuclear war became part of everyday life. Families built fallout shelters, schools held emergency drills, and millions wondered whether a global conflict could begin without warning. Just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, Cuba underwent a dramatic political transformation. In 1959, revolutionary leader Fidel Castro overthrew the government of Fulgencio Batista. As relations with the United States deteriorated, Cuba strengthened its alliance with the Soviet Union. For Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, Cuba presented a strategic opportunity. Placing nuclear missiles there would bring much of the United States within easy striking distance while balancing American missiles already stationed near Soviet territory. During the summer of 1962, Soviet cargo ships quietly crossed the Atlantic carrying missiles, launch equipment, and thousands of military personnel. The operation was carried out under strict secrecy. Equipment was hidden beneath tarps, and many soldiers were told they were participating in a routine exercise. Construction crews worked rapidly after arriving in Cuba, building launch sites before American intelligence could discover what was happening. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flew high above Cuba, photographing areas that had been identified as suspicious. When intelligence analysts examined the images, they found unmistakable evidence of Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction. The photographs were rushed to the White House. Within hours, President John F. Kennedy faced one of the most difficult decisions any world leader had ever encountered. The next 13 days would determine the fate of humanity. The morning after the photographs reached the White House, President John F. Kennedy gathered a small group of his most trusted advisors. The meetings were held in complete secrecy. If news of the missiles reached the public too soon, panic could spread across the United States and give the Soviet Union time to complete the missile sites. The advisors debated every possible response. Some argued that the United States should launch an immediate airstrike to destroy the missile bases before they became operational. Others believed a full-scale invasion of Cuba was necessary, even if it meant direct war with Soviet forces already on the island. A third option was less aggressive but equally risky: a naval blockade to prevent additional Soviet military equipment from reaching Cuba. For days, Kennedy listened carefully. He knew that every choice carried enormous consequences. An airstrike might eliminate the missiles, but it could also kill Soviet soldiers and trigger retaliation in Europe. An invasion could quickly escalate into a global conflict. Even a blockade, which Kennedy called a quarantine, risked confrontation if Soviet ships refused to stop. Meanwhile, construction on the missile sites continued around the clock. Soviet engineers worked day and night, racing to make the launch sites operational before the United States acted. Intelligence reports arriving in Washington painted an increasingly urgent picture. Time was running out. On the evening of October 22, 1962, President Kennedy addressed the American people in a televised speech watched by millions. Calm but firm, he revealed that the Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. He announced that the United States would establish a naval quarantine around the island. Any ship carrying offensive military equipment would be turned back. The speech shocked the world. Families gathered around radios and televisions in disbelief. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, governments prepared for the possibility that war could begin within hours. As American warships moved into position, Soviet cargo ships continued steaming toward Cuba. Every captain at sea understood that the next few hours could determine whether the world entered a nuclear war. If either side opened fire, there was no guarantee the fighting could be contained. Behind the scenes, military commanders on both sides placed their forces on the highest levels of readiness. Strategic bombers were armed with nuclear weapons. Missile crews stood by their launch consoles. Soldiers waited for orders that everyone hoped would never come. For the first time in history, humanity stood on the edge of destruction, not because war had already begun, but because a single mistake, misunderstanding, or moment of panic could start one. By October 24th, 1962, the world was holding its breath. American naval forces had formed a defensive ring around Cuba, and Soviet cargo ships were rapidly approaching the quarantine line. Around the globe, millions followed radio broadcasts, wondering whether the next report would announce the start of World War III. A single gunshot, a misunderstood command, or one nervous officer could trigger a chain of events that no leader would be able to stop. As the distance between the opposing fleets closed, U.S. Navy crews stood at battle stations. Radar operators tracked every movement, while commanders prepared to intercept any ship carrying offensive military equipment. At the same time, Soviet captains received conflicting instructions from Moscow. Some were told to continue toward Cuba, while others were ordered to wait for further instructions. The tension reached its peak when several Soviet ships slowed down and eventually turned around before reaching the quarantine line. For the moment, direct conflict had been avoided, but the crisis was far from over. In Washington and Moscow, secret messages crossed the Atlantic almost nonstop. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev exchanged letters discussing possible solutions. Some messages were calm and diplomatic, while others reflected the immense pressure both leaders were facing. Then came the most dangerous day of the entire crisis. On October 27th, later remembered as Black Saturday, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was killed instantly. Inside the White House, military leaders urged Kennedy to retaliate immediately by bombing the missile sites responsible. For several tense hours, the possibility of open war seemed almost certain. At nearly the same time, another U-2 aircraft accidentally flew into Soviet airspace near Alaska because of navigational problems. Soviet fighter jets scrambled to intercept it, while American fighters armed with nuclear weapons took off to protect the aircraft. Fortunately, the U-2 escaped before either side fired a shot. Beneath the Atlantic Ocean, another crisis was unfolding that remained unknown to the public for decades. A Soviet submarine, cut off from communication with Moscow, had been surrounded by American naval forces. The crew believed that war might already have begun. As U.S. ships dropped practice depth charges intended only as warning signals, those inside the submarine interpreted them as a possible attack. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo powerful enough to destroy an entire fleet. The captain considered launching it. For a brief moment, the fate of the world rested inside one submarine deep beneath the ocean. Deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, aboard the Soviet submarine B-59, the crew had no communication with Moscow. They had been submerged for days. The temperature inside the vessel was rising, batteries were running low, and many sailors believed that war had already begun. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, was convinced that the explosions from American practice depth charges meant they were under attack. Unknown to the U.S. Navy, B-59 carried a nuclear torpedo with destructive power comparable to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Launching that torpedo required the approval of 3 senior officers. 2 agreed that it should be fired. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. Arkhipov argued that they had no proof a nuclear war had begun and insisted they surface instead of launching the weapon. After a tense debate inside the cramped submarine, the captain accepted his recommendation. B-59 surfaced peacefully. Many historians believe Archipov's decision helped prevent a catastrophic escalation that could have led to nuclear war. Above the ocean, negotiations between Washington and Moscow continued. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev exchanged urgent messages searching for a way out of the crisis without humiliating either nation. Khrushchev eventually offered a solution. The Soviet Union would remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba if the United States publicly promised not to invade the island. There was also another condition discussed through secret diplomatic channels. The United States would quietly remove its Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey, which had long been viewed by the Soviet Union as a direct threat. To avoid political fallout, this agreement was kept confidential for many years. On October 28, 1962, Radio Moscow broadcast the announcement the world had been waiting for. The Soviet Union had agreed to dismantle and withdraw its missiles from Cuba. Across the globe, relief replaced fear. Church bells rang in some cities. Newspapers printed extra editions announcing that the immediate danger had passed. Although tensions between the two superpowers remained, humanity had stepped back from the brink. The crisis exposed how easily misunderstandings and miscalculations could bring the world to disaster. In response, both governments introduced measures to reduce the risk of future confrontations. One of the most important was the creation of a direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin, commonly known as the hotline. Instead of relying on slow diplomatic messages, leaders could communicate directly during future emergencies. The Cuban Missile Crisis also encouraged new efforts to control nuclear weapons. In the years that followed, treaties were signed to limit nuclear testing and reduce the chances of accidental war. More than 60 years later, the Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of history's most important lessons. It demonstrated that diplomacy, patience, and careful decision-making can matter as much as military strength. For 13 days, the future of civilization depended on the choices of a handful of individuals. Some were presidents, some were military commanders, and one was a submarine officer whose calm judgment may have saved millions of lives. History often remembers wars that were fought, but sometimes the greatest victory is the war that never happened.